Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise with the aim of increasing the tenor of the debate after that diatribe from Senator McDonald, and to speak on the report into the— You just did interrupt me, Senator McDonald.
Order. Senator Waters, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak about the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Legislation Committee's report into my bill to better protect water from the ravages of the mining and coal seam gas industries, which was tabled earlier today. It's with great shame that the committee and disappointment that the committee has recommended that the bill not be passed. And once again, we see both of the old parties colluding to make sure that the federal government takes no responsibility whatsoever for acting on coal seam gas and protecting our precious and ancient water resources from coal seam gas and from mining. Now, my bill proposes to improve and increase the Environment Minister's power to better protect water. What Environment Minister, what government would not want the power to better protect water from various impacts? It's lost on me, Mr President. And in particular, in the driest inhabited continent on Earth, then surely water should be treated as a national resource. I genuinely don't understand why the federal government still thinks that it is not their business to properly protect our national water resources. Now, particularly given that the states have demonstrated time and time again that they are failing to protect our farmland, they're failing to protect our rural communities, and they're failing to protect our environment from the risks of the rampant coal seam gas industry. You only need to look at the example of the contamination of the Springbok aquifer in 2009 from fracking in my home state of Queensland on our beautiful Darling Downs, of course our best food-producing land, to know that fracking is not safe. And yet, why is the federal government still doing nothing about that? The examples continue. Following the terrible floods in Queensland of just over a year ago, we saw massive pollution of our rivers from both mining pits and also from coal seam gas evaporation ponds. And yet again, massive environmental damage, and still the feds do nothing. And most recently, we saw there'd been a terrible spill in the Pilliga State Forest of New South Wales from a dodgy, if I may say, previous operator of that operation. And again, the feds still think that the states are doing a fine job and the feds shouldn't be bothered at all to do anything about it. Well, I beg to differ, and in fact 67% of Queenslanders beg to differ as well. A poll last week showed that amount of Queenslanders don't support coal seam gas. And rightly so, they're worried about the lack of knowledge that we have about the long-term impacts of this industry. So I wanted to talk in particular to address some of the points that were made in the committee's report about some complaints that they had about the bill, and I wanted to talk a bit about why, in fact, I think the bill is an excellent idea. First of all, as I said, our surface and groundwater systems are ancient, and we don't properly understand how they're connected, and we certainly don't understand the impacts that coal seam gas and other mining is having on them and may have on them in the long term. So there are big threats to our water and our land and our environment. There is an incredible level of uncertainty about our understanding, and we have national bodies like the CSIRO and the Water Commission admitting, giving evidence in that inquiry and putting out various public statements saying that we don't understand the long-term impacts of coal seam gas on our water, and we don't understand enough about the hydrological connectivity of our groundwater and our surface water systems to know whether or not that fracking and other aspects of coal seam gas is safe. So, I mean, these are big warning bells being sounded by our most informed expert bodies. You would think that the government would listen to those expert bodies. Certainly they should. There's been a number of other charges levelled at the bill, and I want to just address the key ones, Mr President. Once again, there's a tendency to say that the states have got this all covered, not a problem, go back to sleep, everybody. Well, look, unfortunately, they are not managing this risk properly. I cited some of those examples of where state regulation has not protected our water resources and hasn't protected our rural communities. Particularly, CSIRO, as I said already, has highlighted the uncertainties about coal seam gas, and I can quote, as coal seam gas is a relatively new industry, whilst the processes are understood, it takes some time to understand the properties associated with any hydrological setting. In a situation where you've done extraction for a limited amount of time, you're working with less information and the uncertainties are higher. That's the first reason why I think the federal government should be involved in properly protecting our water resources, because we simply don't have enough information. It's not okay for the feds to say, because we don't know what we don't know, we're not going to do anything. I think that's a really flimsy excuse. And the second point is, and you've heard me say this before, Mr President, and I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to say this many more times, unfortunately, in this chamber, that there are serious gaps and shortcomings in the states and territories' regulation of this matter. We heard a lot of evidence in the hearing into this bill from various experts, in fact from a body of national lawyers as well as some conservation activists, talking about the various loopholes in state laws and demonstrating, I thought very amply, that the states are simply not doing their job of protecting the environment and protecting our water resources. I wanted to address in particular my disappointment at the position of the National Farmers Federation, who didn't back the bill because they were concerned that at some point in the future another bill might come in that would somehow regulate agricultural water use. Well, this bill does not do that. This bill is squarely confined to regulating the impacts of mining on water, and of course mining includes coal seam gas in the definitions. So I found it a little disappointing that the Farmers Federation were, I think, acting against the interests of their members in recommending that the bill not proceed. In fact, many farmers have told me that they do want the federal government to play a better role to protect water, and that my bill is in fact precisely the means of doing that. So got a bit of a bone to pick there with the National Farmers Federation. I just want to finish off, Mr President, talking about the assertion that the committee makes that somehow the federal government's most recent announcements are adequate in this space. Look, I wish they were. There's been a number of announcements made. First of all, a proposal for national harmonised regulation for coal seam gas through COAG. Now that's all well and good unless you're harmonising to the lowest common denominator. So the Greens will be watching that with great scrutiny to make sure that that isn't the case. Unfortunately, we'll probably be watching for a very long time because, as everyone knows, COAG processes are notoriously slow, and that is another major concern. This coal seam gas industry is absolutely barrelling ahead, and yet we have the government saying, never you mind, COAG will deal with it, don't hold your breath, people. Well, look, it's going to take too long and we're going to see devastating impacts in the meantime. So I don't think, again, that that's a valid excuse for doing nothing. The other assertion that the committee adopts as to why we don't need this bill is that the agreement that the Prime Minister reached with Tony Windsor, MP, to establish an independent expert scientific panel, again, is going to somehow solve all our problems. Well, look, we think this panel is a really good idea and it's a great first step. We support the fact that they're going to be providing advice to government, and we support the fact that they'll be doing bioregional assessments of priority areas. Interested to see how those areas are chosen. No doubt they'll be in marginal seats, but be that as it may, we think it's a great first step. But the problem is that committee won't be able to advise the federal government. They'll simply be advising the states because the federal government doesn't have the power to look at these water impacts because my bill has not yet been passed. That's the very point. It's all well and good to say let's provide science-based decision-making, and we completely support that. But this is just another premise for the federal government to wash its hands of properly protecting our water resources. And I'm afraid I don't think anyone's going to be fooled. So I wanted to finish off, Mr President, in just pointing out that, in fact, despite the committee's report that the bills are necessary and duplicative, a water trigger is in fact what the Prime Minister herself proposed if this COAG agreement doesn't come off. So I found it somewhat perplexing that the report found the bill was unnecessary when it is indeed a foreshadowed policy outcome of the Prime Minister's own undertaking if those COAG processes don't come to fruition. So look, I look forward to the debate on this bill when it comes before this chamber. The Greens have long been advocates for strong national protection for our water resources. They don't respect state borders. The states are not doing a good job protecting our water, and they're unfortunately selling out our rural communities to turn a buck from the mining industry. So the Greens will continue to advocate for better and stronger federal protection for our water resources.